There's more people in it than at an UNCTAD meeting. it's a really good term. Oh, Jesus, I hate that look. When you look down and see yourself. How will I start it? How will I call them to order? I need them to get. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to see that the gavel works wonders. Everyone is very, very welcome. I just want to welcome you to our consultations, welcome you back to our consultations after a forced break, and really to express my thanks to all of you for joining us in person for the consultations. So, can I start by just noting that we meet in a time of war, and I would like to ask you maybe if you would please stand now to observe 1 minute's silence for the victims of the war in Ukraine and the victims of conflict around our world today. Thank you very much. Thank you. So welcome back, welcome to the consultations. Can I just open by, as quickly as possible, running through a few of the housekeeping matters. All of our sessions over the next 3 days will take place in this room from 10 to 1 and from 3 to 6. We will have simultaneous interpretation in the 6 official UN languages. And we will have the standard lunch break from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. So that gives us a total of just under 18 hours to go through the text. So hopefully that will be sufficient. The meeting has been live streamed on the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs website for those unable to join in person, but interventions all need to be made in this room. As I can see that you're fully aware, there are still a few COVID restrictions in place, and all participants, even if you hold an entry pass, must register online via Indico, and face masks are still required indoor in all common areas, and participants, of course, may remove their masks when making an intervention. And the other good news is, of course, that the COVID restrictions on room numbers have been lifted since Monday, and we have a large conference room, but I just encourage you to make the best use of the space available so that we can maintain still an element of social distance. Now, it is over 2 years since we last met in this process in person, and we're joined by a really kind of good, impressive number of delegations from around the world, and I want to especially thank those who have travelled from capitals today. I think your presence is a reflection of the importance that the international communities attaches to this issue. We did not obviously expect to have to take such a long break. We had originally, as you will recall, hoped to conclude these negotiations in March 2020 and to host an adoption conference in Dublin Castle in May 2020. But the best laid plans were destroyed by the pandemic. But we have used the period in between with a round of written consultations, with online events, a high-level webinar, and 3 days of virtual consultations on a revised text. And I really want to thank you all for your very active engagement throughout that process. But it is really clear that in-person negotiations on an issue as important as this are absolutely vital if we are to move towards concluding the text. And that's why we have provided for 3 full days today. And as I say, this may seem like a lot of time for a 3-page draft declaration, but I think it is warranted, and I feel that it is needed, and we want to ensure that all delegations who want to take the floor will have the opportunity to do so. It has been an inclusive process, and we will ensure that it remains so. Today, our discussions will be structured entirely around the draft declaration circulated in March, and we will work by a section-by-section basis. We won't have an opening general debate style section, but I do appreciate that quite a few of you will want to speak in a more general way in your opening remarks, and that is fine. But we hope that you will manage to target your interventions on specific elements in each section. And I should add that we're not going to engage in real-time drafting with the text on screen during these sections, but we do want your specific comments on each section. So I hope we will manage to have a session that involves a bit more than restatement of national positions, and that we'll manage to have as much interaction and dynamism as possible over the next 3 days, because we are moving into the final stages of the negotiation of this text. Written submissions are strongly encouraged, and they may include your pre-prepared remarks. And I thank those who have already submitted their views in writing, but it will be really helpful to have your views in writing. One other small element I want to mention is it will aid the interpreters, but your statements today, if you could email them, if possible, to speeches@un.org, that will be very helpful. Now, we want to be ambitious in the time we have available, and we're in your hands on the finalization of the declaration. To be honest, if it is possible to conclude the discussions within these 3 days, this will be excellent. But we also want to provide space to explore the ideas and consider the points being raised. So my expectation is that one final consultation will be needed, not another 3-day consultation, a shorter one, in order to kind of finalize the political declaration. And we will say a little more about that on Friday, depending on how matters go over the next 3 days. But I would expect at this stage that we would have one final day or two of consultations, maybe towards the end of May, or more likely in early June. So on the draft political declaration itself, we really do appreciate the engagement of everyone on this, as I say, even during the forced break. And there have been a number of significant developments that have given our discussions, I think, an added sense of urgency, and that was clear even at the opening of this meeting. Because the scenes of suffering, humanitarian suffering in the war in Ukraine emphasize the gravity and the urgency of the issue and demonstrate clearly to everyone with a screen the devastating consequences that the use of explosive weapons have when used in densely populated areas. These are scenes that we recognize also from other conflicts, other recent conflicts, and they are a stark reminder of our collective responsibility to address the root causes of humanitarian suffering and to reject any normalization of such scenes. We hope the political declaration will be relevant to current and future conflicts by sending a very, very clear message on the fundamental importance of the protection of civilians in armed conflict. We recognize also that this declaration is, while it has been a long enough process, it is still the beginning rather the end of a process. And it is essential that we produce something that will make a real difference on the ground for those suffering during armed conflict. I think we owe that to them. So Ireland's objective was to have an inclusive and transparent dialogue with the international community, and we will, as I say, ensure that it remains so, and that we will maintain our consultations with all states, relevant UN agencies and bodies, the ICRC and civil society groups who are here in strength with us today. The text you have in front of you is the result of written inputs and also bilateral consultations over recent months. And we received a substantial number of written submissions on the text. And these have been made available with your permission on our EWIPA webpage. And I would encourage you to examine these documents if you haven't already had the chance. Now, there is, as we know, a broad spectrum of views on this issue. And while some divergences of view remain in how to address specific issues, there is clearly overwhelming support for the process and the development of a political declaration that centres on the protection of civilians. And that's the basis on which we want to work over the next 3 days. The process is not operating in a vacuum, and we are continuing to take into account the work that has been ongoing over a number of years, including the EWIPA talks led by Germany, the UN General Assembly First Committee Joint Statement, regional conferences in Maputo in 2017 and Santiago in 2019, the Vienna International Conference, and the debate on the protection of civilians in urban warfare at the UN Security Council a few months ago in January this year. The revised draft you have maintains the structure as the previous draft. It's divided into two main parts. Part A, a preamble section, and an operative section, Part B. To help guide our structured discussion, the paper is further subdivided into Part A, Section 1, which seeks to identify the problems and challenges, and Section 2, detailing relevant aspects of international humanitarian law. Part B, Sections 3 and 4, detail a range of possible operational and political commitments that could be undertaken as part of a political declaration. And I will introduce each section of the text in advance of each agenda item. But first, I just want to highlight a few important general points on the text. And we've made these points before, but they bear repeating. First, the underlying purpose is to promote actions designed to reduce the harm caused to civilians from explosive weapons in populated areas and enhance the protection of civilians. Second, the text does not establish a prohibition on the use of any specific weapon type or seek to create new legal obligations. Indeed, the text is explicit in stating that existing IHL provides the framework to regulate the conduct of armed conflicts and therefore applies to the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And what the text does do is recognize the complexities and the challenges of the operational environment, and it accepts that there is a problem to be addressed and seeks to foster behavioral change to strengthen compliance with IHL. It does not seek to introduce new legal obligations, but we should be clear that it must bring added value through the political commitments it sets out. These commitments, as they stand at the moment, include a series of practical measures for all parties to armed conflict and range from a commitment to strengthen international cooperation and assistance with respect to the identification, development, and exchange of good practices to enhance the protection of civilians. It also includes measures to facilitate the exchange of technical and tactical expertise and calls for improved data collection and casualty recording. It also recognizes the challenges posed by non-state armed groups and the tactics that they often employ. So it does not attempt to be overly prescriptive or exhaustive, and we fully recognize, as I said, that this is part of a process that will require long-term cooperation among and between states, international organizations, and civil society. So that's just framing our discussions for the next 3 days. And unless I see any technical questions on how we proceed, I will open the message with 2 important video messages that we have received. And we'll play them one after another, if they work. The first is from UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Izumi Nakamitsu. And the second is from a survivor of the use of explosive weapons in populated area in Aleppo, Ms. Nujeen Mustafa. So we will play those 2 videos now, and then we will move ahead with our consultations.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to send my message to the consultations to elaborate a political declaration to address the humanitarian impact of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. I wish to express my sincere gratitude to Ireland for its wise and able stewardship over this critical initiative. The revival of talks on practical measures to protect civilians from urban warfare could not come at a more appropriate moment. For the past several weeks, the world has been fixated on the devastating impact of armed conflict. Thousands of civilians have been killed or injured. Entire cities have been laid to waste. Sadly, this has not been a unique or isolated occurrence. Such outcomes are entirely foreseeable when explosive weapons with wide area effects are used in populated areas. This fact is well documented and indisputable. We also know that these impacts do not end with the immediate death and destruction caused by such use of these weapons. Long-term damage to critical infrastructure, disruption of critical services, education, healthcare, sanitation, the loss of economic opportunities. Such indirect and reverberating effects mean that the harms deepen and last far after the fighting has ceased. Thankfully, there are already many examples of good practice on which to base a political undertaking to strengthen the protection of civilians and to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. One of the strongest of these will be a commitment to avoid the use in populated areas of explosive weapons with wide area effects due to the significant likelihood of indiscriminate impact. Such a commitment should be accompanied by follow-on efforts to develop common standards and practical guidance. They should also be complemented by support for efforts to collect data on civilian casualties, including on their cause. This is precisely what Sustainable Development Goal 16.1.2 requires. Agreement on these measures is needed now more than ever. I hope you seize this moment and rise to the occasion. In so doing, you have the support of entities across the United Nations system. I wish you the best of luck in your consultations. Thank you for your attention.
While you have been negotiating whether a declaration against the use of explosive weapons on civilians should be made, 11,076 people have fallen victims to these weapons. And these numbers are just for the last year. Not long ago, I could have been one of these people. I'm Najeen Mustafa, 23 years old, from Aleppo, Syria. My life before the war was not perfect, but I had found a way to make it work for me. I did not view my disability as a disadvantage until the war started. And then I realized that unlike other people, I could not run away and hide. I could not go down to a shelter if we needed to evacuate. And if we are being honest, nobody thinks about people like me. People who can't or have nowhere to hide, who have no means of protecting themselves or escaping a situation that endangers their lives. As Aleppo was being bombed, I was terrified, but I tried very hard not to panic because I knew that there was nothing anyone in my family could do to make the situation better. So I tried to stay strong for everyone. As the sound of the bombing grew louder and louder, I raised the volume on the television higher and higher. I became very jumpy at the slightest noise. I am in a safe country now, doing much better, but the feelings I experienced at the time, the feeling of dread that things are going to go from bad to worse, is something that I will never forget. And it breaks my heart that people in the Ukraine and around the world are still experiencing those feelings. Throughout history, decision makers, diplomats, generals, heads of state have discussed world problems while sitting at a table, exchanging pleasantries, and having a nice cup of coffee. They never felt the urgency of the situation because they have time. But people trapped in a conflict zone do not. Today, you have the possibility to change a terrible situation and protect civilians living in conflicted areas. I call upon you to stop bombing towns and cities. I call upon you to support victims and survivors. I call upon you to support everyone who has had to flee because their homes have been bombed. You have the power and solutions, but you need to recognize this as a priority. The victims of these conflicts cannot wait any longer. I have faith that this conference will end in a declaration. And I hope that nobody will ever again have the same experience as mine. Thank you.
Can I thank Izumi Nakamitsu through her UN colleagues for her very important message. And I want to thank Nujeen Mustafa for her powerful testimony and for putting before us the urgency of the situation we are addressing today. Thank you both very much. I want to move now to agenda item 2 and the substantive part of our meeting. I will just give an introduction now to part A, section 1, and then invite comments from you on that. So part A, section 1 of the declaration, which you all have before you, is very much a preamble, and it sets out the fundamental reasons we seek to address this problem through a political declaration. It highlights the links between the urbanization of armed conflict and the increased risk to civilians, and it frames how the use of explosive weapons in populated areas can aggravate and increase the risk to civilians during armed conflict. The section also addresses the direct impact of EWIPA on civilians and civilian objects through blast, debris, and fragmentation effects, as well as the severe, long-lasting indirect or reverberating effects that EWIPA can cause. And the most prominent change, I think, in the text here from the last version, which is followed throughout the rest of the section, and indeed the text as a whole, is the deletion of the term wide area effects. And at the last round of virtual consultations and the subsequent written consultations, as well as in our bilateral discussions, the vast majority of delegations, including states and civil society, requested the deletion of this term. Not all, but the vast majority. For some, the term narrowed the text too much, while for others, the lack of a definition for the term caused significant difficulty. Now, we understand that some delegations may want the declaration to capture the greater risk posed to civilians by certain heavy weapons, and we're happy to explore potential drafting solutions. But I just wanted to highlight that as one of the most significant developments in the text since our last consultations. Elsewhere, the interconnectivity of essential services in urban areas is highlighted to emphasize the point that damage done to one service can negatively affect services elsewhere, causing harm that extends well beyond the impact area of a strike. And as well as referencing the impact on services such as housing, healthcare, schools, food systems, and cultural heritage sites, we also highlight how the provision of basic needs, including access to food and access to education, are disrupted. Another important element is the impact that the use of EWIPA can have on the SDGs and on displacement of people within and across borders. And additionally, a number of comments received requested that the declaration acknowledge that many militaries already implement operational policies and practices which are designed to mitigate civilian harm, which include a detailed understanding of the effects of explosive weapons on a military target and its surrounding areas, and the associated risk to civilians in populated areas. These issues are highlighted in paragraph 1.5, and which also acknowledges that there is scope for practical improvements to achieve the full and universal implementation of and compliance with IHL. The importance of data collection and civilian casualty recording is emphasized in paragraph 1.6, and the draft emphasizes the importance of sharing and making that data publicly available where feasible. Finally, the work of the UN and the ICRC, as well as civil society, on the impacts and long-term humanitarian consequences of EWIPA are welcomed, and the text encourages further research into the gendered impacts of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. So that's a general introduction to this opening section, which we will now discuss. And so what I will do now is open the floor to delegations to express their views on Section 1, and to do so by raising your nameplate, and we will have a speaking list. And I will open by calling on Ukraine, the ambassador of Ukraine, to speak. You have the floor, Ambassador.
Ambassador, good morning, everyone. Yes, Ukraine is on everyone's mind these days as the world sees the horrific images of the Russian atrocities against the civilian population. The document that we are discussing today has received particular importance, relevance, and urgency in light of this unprovoked and unjustified armed aggression of the Russian Federation. The magnitude and cruelty with which the Russian armed forces shell and bomb the residential areas are beyond human understanding. Over 3,000 people have already been killed, thousands injured. The real figures are much, much, much higher. Entire cities and towns have been turned into ashes of dead land because of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. I think that in light of these circumstances, we have to make sure that the document that we discuss today reflects the new patterns of explosive, of indiscriminate shellings of populated areas. The UN General Assembly has adopted the resolution aggression against Ukraine. There are a number of paragraphs that could be incorporated in this document related to the indiscriminate shelling and indiscriminate use of explosive weapons and long-term risks posed by damage to civilian infrastructure of unexploded ordnance to the civilian population. It should also reflect the new, it's not new, but a very real term for the armed conflict that we have seen in the past 42 days. This armed conflict is called aggression. So we think it is important that in the list, in the first section where we speak about the character of armed conflicts, that we also add the new pattern of armed conflict. Unprecedented and most egregious is the aggression. The aggression is defined as the use of force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of another state. So we are open to discuss with other delegations how we can incorporate this unique and unprecedented type of conflict in this document. We also think that in this part we could include the language from the recently adopted UN General Assembly resolution about the besiegement of and the shelling and airstrikes in densely populated cities, as well as attacks striking civilian objects, in particular schools and other educational institutions, water and sanitation systems, medical facilities, and their means of transport and equipment, and the abduction of local officials and attacks striking diplomatic premises and cultural sites. So we believe that these new realities that the world has seen in the past months should be reflected in this document to prevent their recurrence in the future. To finish, I would say that the use of inherently indiscriminate reports is a violation of international humanitarian law, and it is clearly reflected in this document. It constitutes a war crime. So we think it could also find some reflection in the document. My delegation stands ready to work with all of you to ensure that this document has attraction on the situation on the ground and has a relevance for the present and for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I give the floor now to the European Union.
Thank you, Ambassador, for giving me the floor to deliver general remarks. Mr. Chair, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union. The candidate countries, Montenegro and Albania, as well as Ukraine and Georgia, aligned themselves with this statement. At the outset, I would like to thank Ireland for the transparent and inclusive consultation process titled Strengthening the Protection of Civilians from the Humanitarian Consequences Arising from the Use of Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas. We also appreciate your continuous efforts to draft and negotiate a political declaration despite challenges caused by COVID-19 pandemic. Today's discussion cannot be timelier, as we speak about the compliance with international humanitarian law and its fundamental obligations and principles. An unprovoked war leads to bombing and shelling of innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure. We condemn in the strongest possible terms Russia's unprecedented military aggression against Ukraine. By its unprovoked and unjustified military actions, Russia is grossly violating international law, including international humanitarian law, and undermining European and global security and stability. Ukraine is becoming a full-scale humanitarian catastrophe. Every day, civilians, including women, children, persons with disabilities, and older persons, are being attacked, including with explosive weapons such as vacuum bombs, booby traps, and cluster munitions. We deplore the loss of life and the human suffering. Russia bears full responsibility for this act of aggression and all the destruction and loss of life it causes. The EU demands that Russia ceases its military actions immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraws all its military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine, and fully respects Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence within its internationally recognized borders. At all times, we call on Russia to comply with its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international refugee law, and in particular to comply with its obligations under IHL as regards the protection of civilians, including women and children. Russia also needs to stop its disinformation campaigns and cyber attacks. Let me highlight that attacks carried out with new technologies and cyber means must also respect IHL. States must also allow and facilitate humanitarian relief, so it is not acceptable that Russia does not allow the evacuation of civilians. The EU reaffirms the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence in provisions of humanitarian assistance, and reaffirms also the need for all actors engaged in the provision of humanitarian assistance in situations of complex emergencies to promote and fully respect these principles. The EU and its member states express full solidarity with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. The EU resolutely supports Ukraine's inherent right to self-defense and the Ukrainian armed forces' efforts to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity and population in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. The EU expresses its serious concern about the growing number of reported breaches of IHL, including attacks on civilians and civilian objects in Ukraine and other conflicts, and calls on all parties to all conflicts to respect IHL and the humanitarian principles. We recall that international law, in particular international humanitarian law, fully applies to the employment of all weapons and weapon systems, and that those who employ these weapons remain responsible and accountable for their use. Ensuring compliance with IHL is crucial, not least for civilians, when armed conflicts are increasingly fought in densely populated areas, exposing civilians and civilian infrastructure to substantial risks. Indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian objects, including attacks against medical facilities, schools, and humanitarian workers, and the arbitrary denial of humanitarian access to people in need are all unacceptable and constitute violations of IHL. Parties to an armed conflict are obliged to take immediate steps to uphold the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. This should be done by taking all feasible precautions in the choice of means and methods of attacks with a view to avoiding and in any event to minimizing incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. The parties to the conflict must, to the extent feasible, avoid locating military objectives and to take all feasible precautions to avoid fighting from positions in or near densely populated areas, including near hospitals, schools, or universities, or along routes to or from them to take necessary precautions to protect the civilian population, individual civilians, and civilian objects against the dangers resulting from military operations, including by allowing civilians to leave besieged or encircled areas. On the proposed political declaration, we appreciate Ireland's efforts in the last 2 years to keep the process alive. The changes to various drafts still kept the focus on the main aim of this declaration, namely the support for all efforts to strengthen compliance with IHL with the aim to protect the civilian populations and civilian objects from the effects of hostilities. On our part, the EU will continue to promote compliance with IHL in its own activities as well in its relations with third parties, as expressed inter alia in the EU guidelines on promoting compliance with IHL. We will continue to speak out against violations of IHL, support enhancing the protection of civilians and civilian objects, in particular those that are vital for civilian populations, and fight against impunity for violations of IHL and human rights abuses. In conclusion, at the same time, we want to support the idea of a follow-up process to consult on the implementation of the political declaration and serve at the same time as a platform for future military-to-military discussions on matters related to urban warfare and the civilian harm that could arise from it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor now to a joint statement by Mexico and Chile.
Ambassador, the delegations of Chile and Mexico thank the delegation of Ireland for its tireless efforts and leadership conducting the EWIPA process, especially taking into account the dire circumstances we've had to face due to the pandemic and the overall uncertainty in terms of how to advance the negotiating process. Our delegations are not oblivious to the humanitarian catastrophe that is taking place currently in Ukraine due to the invasion by Russia. This act goes against the most fundamental rules of the international system. It paints to see so vividly the widespread effects of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Images of Bucha, Mariupol, and other cities in Ukraine are scandalous and merit our heartfelt condolences. This only confirms that the data that civil society has been sharing yearly from armed conflicts over the world patently demonstrate the disproportionate effects of their use on the civilian population, as we can clearly see again from the latest report that was presented yesterday by Action on Armed Violence and the powerful testimony we have just heard in the introduction of this meeting by a victim of EWIPA. These are the facts that confirm the urgency of advancing policy through an ambitious and forward-looking political declaration that has as at its core the human security concerns. We would, nevertheless, caution against politicizing the issue at hand, focusing on a particular armed conflict. We understand that the purpose of the political declaration is for the long haul and with respect to any armed conflict. At the outset, we would like to thank Ireland for the circulation of the current draft. We are of the view that many sections have improved from the previous iteration. We particularly value that some of our language proposals have been incorporated to this version of the text. Nevertheless, we believe it can be further improved to achieve the ultimate objective we are aiming at, a meaningful political declaration that puts the protection of civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas at the forefront of our concerns, today more than ever. Among the major improvements that can be identified, we highlight the following. First, the removal of the caveated language throughout the text. The draft declaration now clearly recognizes that the humanitarian consequences on the use of explosive weapons are an objective fact, which has been extensively documented and proven by the UN, the ICRC, and civil society, and other relevant sources of information. This allows us to acknowledge that the use of explosive weapons in populated areas in and of itself present complex challenges to the protection of civilians and need particular policies. 2, in general terms, the reference to explosive weapons with no qualifier in the title and throughout the text is applicable to most of the political commitments being negotiated. However, there will be paragraphs where the more specific term of explosive weapons with wider effects is still applicable, particularly with regard to paragraph 3.3. 3, there is a clear acknowledgement of the multifaceted nature of the effects caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas on civilian population, recognizing not only the direct effects, but also those effects that extend beyond time and space to affect the critical infrastructure encompassing potentially the general community of the populated areas, and for such a period that it goes beyond the immediate damage. These effects, whether we call them indirect, reverberating, gravely affect the fulfillment of the basic needs, fundamental human rights, and the development goals of a large part, if not the entire community. 4, we also appreciate the centrality given throughout the text to the much more focused term of a WIPA, rather than the broader and more imprecise category of urban warfare. Notwithstanding the range of challenges presented by the growing urban nature of contemporary armed conflict, a WIPA has been correctly identified and understood as an issue of specific humanitarian concern, which should be addressed through specific commitments. 5, finally, we would also like to highlight improvements in the drafting of the victim assistance provision. It has been strengthened as the main focus is now on the victims and their needs, rather than on states making efforts to do so. It has also broadened the scope of the category of victims, which now includes those injured, survivors, family members of people killed and or injured, and affected communities, which is in line with other progressive instruments that address the issue of victim assistance. Other improvements and areas where we consider the draft declaration needs strengthening will be highlighted in the section-by-section comments. We expect this to be a very productive meeting, which allows us to make substantive progress towards the adoption, in the shortest term possible, of a meaningful political declaration, even more meaningful today than when we started this process. We'll leave it at here and not enter into the specific section 1 comments, because if not, our intervention might be too extensive, but we'll come back with the specific comments in section 1. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Humanity and Inclusion, which I understand includes a number of parliamentarians.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will speak in French. Excellences, Mesdames.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of states, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, allow me to thank you for having given us, parliamentarians of 3 countries this speaking time at the outset of your discussions. Over 90% of victims of explosive weapons in cities are civilians. This figure speaks for itself. Mariupol, Dnipro, Kharkiv at the current time, but recently Mosul in Iraq, Sana'a in Yemen, Aleppo in Syria. Cities, towns have for decades become the epicenter of armed conflicts. And with this, we have seen infrastructure and hundreds of thousands of civilian victims, as well as schools and hospitals. That is why we believe it is so important that you, states, recognize in Section 1 of this text the systemic nature of humanitarian harm caused by the use of EWIPA in populated areas, even when these weapons are targeting a military objective and when it's not civilians who are directly targeted, as we've seen tragically in Ukraine recently. That's 90%. On this, then, we have decided to build a cross-party coalition of deputies in order to bring this subject to the very forefront of the agenda in our country. In 2018, 95 French parliamentarians were mobilized to address the French government, 115 in 2020, and the list has simply grown over time. In parallel, we've seen this also being stepped up in Europe, in Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, and elsewhere. Parliamentarian diplomacy has come to light, and in 2021, this culminated in a European conference, leading to a joint call of 210 French and German deputies, calling on France and Germany to adopt an ambitious, strong declaration against the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. This was the culmination of determined, strong commitment of parliamentarians from all swathes and a cooperation model of European parliaments around one single objective, that of protecting civilians. 2 weeks ago, 91 French parliamentarians signed a new document at the outcome of these last negotiations, as we're convinced that only an ambitious political declaration will have an impact on the protection of civilians in populated areas. The tragedy that we're seeing in Ukraine shows this clearly. The adoption of common positions is no longer an ideal, but it's a real possibility. And we are convinced that the affirmation of our universal human rights values, and beginning with the protection of civilians, comes through an unequivocal commitment of states against the use of these weapons in populated areas. We parliamentarians support the language proposed by the OCRC, the UN Secretary General, the INEW, and various states in paragraph 3.3, seeking to avoid the use of EWIPA and therefore developing a presumption of non-usage. This is the only realistic way of better protecting civilians in the face of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. 20 years ago, you're well aware that we saw commitment from NGOs, citizens, parliamentarians, but also and above all from states. This enabled great strides forward to be made in favor of protecting civilians. Together, you have enshrined in law the prohibition of the use of anti-personnel mines, cluster munitions, chemical weapons, arms with indiscriminate effects. And today, we can take our fight forward now that to protect civilians in zones of war. This fight is not simply just affecting a handful of us, but it's also the vision of the world that we want for tomorrow, for the thousands of civilian victims, and that citizens are calling for loud and clear. The political declaration that you're going to be discussing, and I hope discussing for the last time, will give states and the world a historic opportunity to finally ensure the protection of civilians. Let's take that opportunity. I thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be with you here this morning.
Sorry, microphone.
These friends, it's a pleasure to be with you here this morning to discuss this important issue alongside parliamentary colleagues from France and from Belgium. And I should say at the outset, I'm particularly pleased to see my Irish neighbours give this matter such prominence. Although the world is sadly not short of examples of why we need more robust international norms and standards on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, our newspapers and TV screens today are filled with the rolling reminder as to why this must be given the utmost attention it deserves. And I wish to focus my remarks on sections 3 and 4, if I might, of the draft text. For a robust declaration, the text needs to be strengthened with an explicit commitment to tracking civilian harm. As currently drafted, the text contains no specific requirement beyond a preamble and means that there will be a gap in information so significant, colleagues, that it currently risks undermining efforts to improve future operations and strategy. The agreement would be strengthened with a commitment to establish capabilities to track, analyse, respond to and learn from incidents of civilian harm in real time. There is no possible reason that state militaries cannot build those capabilities and be required to do so, not least because so many civil society groups already do so. The agreement should also include references to risk education on explosive remnants of war. It should ensure the marking, clearance and removal or destruction of explosive ordnances as swiftly as possible at the end of hostilities and the provision of risk education. Because, as is so often the case, it is children who find these remnants of war when playing outdoors. There should be a robust commitment on data sharing. As currently drafted, the caveat of where appropriate does give me and my colleagues concern. States should be committed to collecting and sharing information on civilian casualties and objects, as Russia's current aggression against Ukraine shows us accountability matters, and the caveat of where appropriate could allow states to be absolved of accountability. And there should be an explicit commitment to collect and record the locations targeted by explosive weapons, the number of weapons used, and the general location of known and probable unexploded ordnances. Colleagues, to sum up my remarks, we have a chance here over the next 48 hours to reach an agreement that matches the moment that we all find ourselves in. And as we convene here at the Palace of Nations, ask yourself what you want people in the places of Bucha, in Kherson, in Kharkiv, or in Mariupol to hear of this convention. At a time when the international order, designed to keep all of us free and at peace, is under unprecedented assault and unprecedented strain, those of us who believe in that order must continue to give it the new life it needs to succeed. Accountability matters. So I beseech you, and in particular those in the United Kingdom delegation, to achieve an agreement that meets the moment of today. And I hand over to my colleague from Belgium.
Mr. Chair, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for allowing us to speak as parliamentarians on behalf of our constituencies in front of you, high representatives of governments in such a historic moment. Il y a exactement...
Exactly 1 year ago, my parliament in Belgium became the first in the world to, with a very large majority, announced that it was in favour of a resolution to have an international declaration which was strong and ambitious to protect civilians from explosive weapons in populated areas. The expectations of the people that we represent are vast, and that is why we are here today with you in Geneva, because civilians are no longer collateral damage. They are, in fact, the main victims of armed conflicts now. The war in Ukraine is reminding us of that every day. The Belgian Parliament has refused to accept these deaths and to accept that they're inevitable. We must come to the assistance of civilians and alleviate their suffering, because they are trapped by this bombing, like in Mariupol, and they need to be given unconditional access to humanitarian aid, all people, families and communities that are affected. We would require or request that victim assistance be included in the declaration by providing medical care in the long term, providing psychological support and giving access to education system.
We are not alone. In Belgium, as I've said, we have built a strong and large majority of parliamentarians from across all the political spectrum, from the left to the right, to ask you to avoid, to avoid heavy bombs in densely populated areas. And in Europe, as you can see, we stand united with our German, French, and British colleagues. Yet, ladies and gentlemen, the moment has come to turn words into deeds. When we see the horrible images of civilians killed in Kharkiv in Ukraine, in Aleppo in Syria, or in Sana'a in Yemen, I believe that the sole and only question we should ask ourselves as political leaders is whether we really do enough to save innocent lives. I must tell you, this is my very first time I speak, and I have the honor to speak and to address the UN in Geneva. Excellencies, I came to Geneva for this very special moment, for sending this very simple message. You do have the power in the coming days to pass a declaration which could effectively protect thousands of innocent civilians against explosive weapons. Please use your power and just do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is important we hear the voice of elected parliamentarians. Thank you very much. I give the floor now to the representative of Turkey, who will be followed by France. Turkey, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for arranging consultations in order to hear opinions on the draft political declaration. We appreciate Ireland's leadership and tireless efforts in the last 2 years. Turkey supports the efforts to address the humanitarian impact of the indiscriminate use of explosive weapons in populated areas and shares the need to discuss and implement policies to reduce harm to civilians. However, it isn't very reassuring to see that the suggestions we made last year were not taken into account. We will continue to deliver our views constructively. Mr. Ambassador, it would be appropriate to include the qualifier indiscriminate before the use of EVIPA in the title and throughout the text, differentiate between lawful and unlawful uses of weapons, and better aligns this language with international law. And the third sentence of 1.1 should be as follows. The causes of this risk involve a range of factors, including the indiscriminate use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which is non-compliant with military necessity principle and pose complex challenges for the protection of civilians. In recent years, we have seen the widespread use of reverberating effects, which is not specified in the IHL. In the text, I mean paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, and 4.2. It would be appropriate to use indirect effects instead of the expression mentioned above. In our view, the political declaration should not set additional standards beyond the existing obligations determined by international conventions to which states are parties. The draft text should accurately reflect the balance between the need to protect civilians in conflict zones and the ability of a state to defend itself. Within this context, the political declaration should not pave the way for terrorist groups to use populated areas as safe havens for their heinous acts. For that reason, a new paragraph as 1.8 should be added. This political declaration shall not be interpreted as creating additional legal rights and obligations under the international humanitarian law. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to France, to be followed by the United States, la France.
Merci.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. A very good morning, everybody, dear colleagues. I shall speak in addition to the statement delivered by the European Union before me at the outset. I should like to thank you, Chairman, for having organized these very important consultations. We've been waiting for them for quite a while now, of course, and we do need to meet urgently and to endeavor to finalize our process here. This initiative is extremely important. today more so than ever. We must imagine the ways in which we can reduce human suffering by taking account of the experience that has been acquired by states and by taking account also of the studies carried out by representatives of civil society, who I welcome, and I also greet the parliamentarians who are here with us because they are contributing valuably to our discussions. Attacks waged against the civilian population and the deliberate use of explosive weapons against civilians with severe effects are entirely unacceptable. The indiscriminate use of explosive weapons in areas where civilians are present in very many numbers is likely to lead to considerable loss of human life, to destroy infrastructure, providing basic needs and essential services, and the vast socioeconomic effects can be devastating and long-lasting. We're seeing this currently just as much as we have seen it in the past. Russia is currently waging a siege war in Ukraine in the context of unarmed aggression in flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter and the fundamental principles on which international order is based, as well as European security. I would also take this opportunity to welcome the statement delivered by my colleague from Ukraine. My delegation stands in full solidarity and support. Russia is relentlessly bombing Ukrainian cities and deliberately striking civilians, as well as civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, maternity wards and units. It is completely violating the fundamental principles of IHL and waging a real strategy of terror. These attacks are deliberately targeting civilians in Ukraine, and they constitute a war crime. The international community must ensure that the perpetrators of these acts are held accountable. Russia's action in this conflict is intolerable and must be condemned. And I note that Russia is not present in this room, which speaks volumes regarding its general attitude and what it thinks of IHL and international law as a whole. Chairperson, the consultations that we're undertaking today must seek to specifically and lastingly strengthen the protection of civilians and their lives. It must prevent and reduce human suffering, and for that we need to strongly reaffirm the rules and principles of IHL. We must urge states, non-state actors, whoever they may be, to immediately cease deliberately targeting civilian populations, as well as indiscriminate attacks on civilians and their goods and property, and the terror which we are all witnessing today. We must work to ensure that this is better respected. We need to together strengthen specific measures aiming to ensure full respect for these rules and principles, while we take into account the challenges posed by the urban area. Our future declaration must see certain practices evolving and must integrate measures which will enable us to overcome these issues around urban area warfare when it comes to objectives and strategies. My country will continue to closely support, as we have stated several times, to share these good practices, enabling us to ensure that these principles of law are translated into the reality of war in urban areas. I thank you, Chairman, for Rev 2 of the draft, which is a good basis. We are fully aware of the work that has gone into preparing this document, and to have it made acceptable to all countries who I believe are very committed in this room to this process. This declaration may well bring, or needs to have, a real universal value. It needs to have real weight and needs to be signed by the entire international community. This will be a long-term goal, but it is important to have that in mind. In conclusion, let me assure you of my country's full attachment to this process and to welcome everyone's mobilization, the mobilization of the entire international community to ensure full respect of IHL and the protection of civilians. Thank you very much.
Merci. And
Thank you.
the floor now to the United States, to be followed by Austria. US, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gaffey, and all of your colleagues for your work following our virtual session last March. The United States appreciates very much the challenge you faced addressing and incorporating the edits and comments that you received from such a wide range of delegations, which hold diverse views and perspectives. Thank you for listening to all our views. I think, as others have said, we're really glad to be here and to meet in person this time. And we hope very much that we can make progress over the next 3 days. Overall, the United States delegation views this draft as an improvement on the prior draft. Still, however, we think additional changes are needed so that states like the United States, which are responsible, militarily active states, can join. We very much want this process to succeed, and it's critical that the text reflect the challenges inherent in urban warfare and that it be implementable by responsible militaries. First, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a few general remarks in light of the grave circumstances in Ukraine. As others have already highlighted, Russia is carrying out a premeditated and unprovoked and an unjustified attack on its sovereign neighbor, which is a blatant violation of the UN Charter. The United States stands steadfastly with Ukraine and its people and condemns in the strongest terms Russia's illegal invasion. We've seen numerous credible reports of indiscriminate attacks and attacks deliberately targeting civilians, as well as other atrocities, such as the world has seen most recently in Bucha. We are watching in horror as Russia's forces destroy apartment buildings, homes, schools, hospitals, critical infrastructure, civilian vehicles, shopping centers, and ambulances, leaving thousands of civilians killed and wounded. We call on President Putin immediately to stop this war and to withdraw Russia's forces from Ukraine. As much as we share a deep sense of shock, sadness, and anger, we also want to commend the bravery, the resilience, and the determination that we have seen from the Ukrainian people. The Ukrainians have inspired the world with their heroic resistance to Russia's brutal war. As we continue to see daily reports of Russian attacks killing and wounding civilians, we are reminded of the importance of the work that all of us are here to do today, which is to strengthen the protection of civilians during armed conflict. The inherent challenges of conducting military operations in urban areas will continue to demand our attention as more and more of the world's population is found there. This declaration can have an immediate impact if it promotes practical, realistic measures that militarily active states that take their IHL obligations seriously can readily implement and find effective in reducing civilian casualties. The follow-on mechanism in paragraph 4.4 is particularly important as a way that militaries from around the world can learn from each other and can continue to improve their policies and their practices. Establishing a positive, collaborative way forward that focuses on military-to-military exchanges of technical expertise and good practices could make tangible progress toward the goals that we all share. For this reason, we think this declaration can add great value but the impact of this declaration will be much more significant if responsible and militarily active states are able to champion it into the future. Existing IHL appropriately accounts for the realities of war and reduces unnecessary suffering. Russia's blatantly unlawful actions call into question its commitment, not the validity of the IHL rules that it violates. This is why the U.S. delegation continues to believe that this declaration need not and should not attempt to introduce new interpretations of existing IHL, purport to create new IHL standards, or include commitments based on novel and poorly defined concepts not reflected in existing IHL, such as the so-called reverberating effects. Such terms only tend to confuse rather than to clarify states' obligations under international law. My delegation's top concern with this declaration is in section 3.3. As currently drafted, the text is not something that the U.S. can support because it does not either reflect existing IHL or state a commitment that sufficiently accounts for operational realities. However, we do believe it can be redrafted in such a way that would be consistent with existing IHL, while at the same time committing states to adopt and implement policies and practices that will be more protective of civilians than what is required by IHL. We think this is a realistic approach that can make a real difference, and we will be suggesting edits along those lines. Finally, it's important to acknowledge at the outset of our discussions that explosive weapons are a legitimate and a lawful means of warfare. They must be used consistent with IHL. For example, they may sometimes be needed to attack military objectives in urban areas that threaten harm to civilians. Our declaration needs to take this into account, and it cannot give an unrealistic impression. Mr. Chairman, I was prepared to go into specific drafting suggestions in section 1, but in light of the other opening statements by delegations, it may be best if we wait to give those later, but I'm in your hands on that point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That approach will work fine. Thank you very much. I will give the floor now to Austria, to be followed by Switzerland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the outset, I would like to thank Ireland, thank you and your team for your strong work. Sorry. I would like to thank you for the excellent work on the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. It's a pleasure to be able to meet in person. Indeed, adopting a political declaration on enhancing the protection of civilians in populated areas during armed conflict could not be timelier. The protection of civilians in armed conflict is paramount, and the evidence of the urgency of this issue is clear. I would like to add a few points to the EU statement from a national perspective. Mr. Chair, in Austria's view, the revised draft has improved significantly. Reflecting the numerous inputs and comments received, we welcome that a number of previously more contested issues seem now to be reflected in a balanced manner. This is an excellent basis to work on during the next 3 days. We welcome the clear structure of the text. The latest version has gained in clarity and is well formulated. The draft text is now better focused on the protection of civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which we consider to be the core purpose of our engagement. This will facilitate the implementation of this declaration and contribute to achieving effective change on the ground. Some areas would benefit from further clarity or precision. While we will provide detailed comments as we go through the text, allow me to name 3 key areas. First, the risk of humanitarian harm on civilians in all its dimensions, from immediate short to long term, and the reverberating effects should be accurately reflected in the declaration, as these risks are the driving motivation behind our efforts. Second, the commitment section should also include a clear commitment to promote adherence to IHL in the international community. And third, Austria very much supports enhancing effective implementation of IHL through practical measures, as reflected in the draft. The implementation mechanism should be more comprehensive, and it would be beneficial to offer additional forms of cooperation among key stakeholders under the umbrella of the political declaration. We would like to congratulate Ireland also for having produced a readable text. This is an accomplishment, given the ambition to keep the text as short as possible. And it is of key importance, of course, that this is a political document that should be understood not only by experts, but also by a broader public, including persons participating in or being affected by armed conflict. And the draft before us provides a solid basis, and we are optimistic that we can give it a finishing touch over the next 3 days and conclude our work. And it's very important that we conclude it, because whilst we discuss the political declaration, we see the urgency of this issue right in front of our eyes. The unprovoked war in Ukraine, with bombing and shelling of innocent civilians and civilian infrastructure, leads to devastating consequences as we speak. We condemn Russia's unprecedented military aggression against Ukraine in the strongest possible terms, which is a violation of international law, including IHL. We are appalled, as many colleagues have also stated, by the pictures of atrocities in Bucha and other Ukrainian cities. Within weeks, Ukraine has become a full-scale humanitarian catastrophe, and every day civilians, including women, children, persons with disabilities, and older persons are being attacked with explosive weapons and cluster munitions. We deplore the loss of life and the human suffering, and the reverberating effects as a result of the destruction of civilian infrastructure are also catastrophic. The horrible developments in Ukraine are all too reminiscent of other conflicts, most notably in Syria and Yemen, where the core principles of IHL have been and continue to be grossly violated, and where explosive weapons are used in populated areas with resulting devastating impact on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Violations of international law, including IHL, are unacceptable, and we clearly see that these violations will not remain unresponded. Our international order is based on a rules-based international system and the rule of law, so perpetrators must and will be held accountable. And respect for these principles of international relations is the key to all our security and to preserving humanity and human dignity. It's important that the international community takes a clear stance against this, and I hope that we will keep this very much in mind when we try to conclude our work on the declaration. Mr. Chair, for the section 1, we actually only had one specific comment, which I may add now, so that I don't have to take the floor again, which would be in section 1.3 to add after housing also hospitals, to specifically include hospitals into this list. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Switzerland, to be followed by the United Kingdom. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, sir. Looking at the humanitarian consequences of the use following from explosive weapons in populated areas, recent armed conflicts and the Russia's aggression against Ukraine have shown once again how it is necessary to improve protection of civilians in urban areas and to better apply international humanitarian law under such circumstances. Switzerland is convinced of the need to come up with a strong political statement that will have broad support, including from states with operational military experience that is relevant. Only in this way will the declaration make a difference, specifically in the field. I should like to thank Ireland for its role as propelling this important problem before us today, as well as for organizing these informal consultations here in Geneva. Sir, your able leadership during prior constructive consultations has made it possible to improve the draft in a number of ways. Generally speaking, the text has become more uniform, more specific, and more consistent. Now, as you've asked us to discuss this first section directly, I should like to stress 4 specific points as to the title of the declaration and this first section. These would also apply more generally to the declaration as a whole. First of all, the new draft more clearly defines the problem that we are supposed to deal with. In particular, the new formulation throughout the text that the consequences flowing or arising from, as opposed to can arise, so arising rather than can arise, which is what we'd had in the text so far. And this is more precise than what we'd had before, and we're pleased to note this change. It's much clearer to have consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Secondly, the deletion of the expression with wide area effects throughout the text, a source of ambiguity has been removed, and we welcome this change as well. Indeed, international humanitarian law must be respected in all circumstances during any use of explosive weapons. But in order to be useful, the concept of explosive weapons with specific effects, such as blast or munitions over a vast area, these lead to specific problems for protecting civilians and IHL. This applies to paragraphs in section 1, but probably to other paras in the text as well. Third, it is important for the declaration which is aimed at better protecting civilians, not only look at explosive weapons, but look at broader challenges in war in urban areas. And this is also relevant in terms of follow-up mechanisms on the declaration, which should promote an exchange of good practices quite beyond simply the use of explosive weapons. And finally, Switzerland is pleased to note the new wording in a number of paragraphs, and in particular 1.5, 1.6, and 2.2, avoiding and reducing to a minimum, or in English, to avoid and in any event minimize humanitarian damage as opposed to the mitigate, the word mitigate, which we'd had so far. Indeed, this new wording is more in conformity with IHL, which requires not only mitigating the effects to civilians, but to constantly make sure that civilians are spared in the use of military operations. As to attacks, all practical measures must be taken to avoid or reduce to as much as possible damage to civilians, and both death and injury, and damage to property as well. Thank you very much, sir.
Merci, and I give the floor now to the United Kingdom, to be followed by Japan. United Kingdom, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chair, and thank you for gathering us here today. With your permission, I'll make a few general remarks and then hand over to my colleague to make a couple of comments on the text of Section 1. As we all know, we're gathered here today, this week, to find common ground on how we can reduce the humanitarian impact of war. Tragically, as we've heard from the powerful video messages at the beginning of this meeting, there has been no shortage of cases of brutal violence in cities across the world in recent years. This has been highlighted in the most shocking way during Russia's premeditated, unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine, which, as has been noted, is an egregious breach of the UN Charter, and most particularly by their barbaric, indiscriminate and indeed deliberate attacks on civilians. Russia's horrific actions show blatant disregard, even contempt, for the lives of innocents, and constitute a clear violation of international humanitarian law, and indeed even evidence of war crimes. Let me once again express the United Kingdom's solidarity with the Ukrainian government and people as they fight for their lives, their freedom, and their future. Alongside other cases around the world, it reaffirms the need for this process, and should lead us to redouble our commitment to the protection of civilians and to compliance with and enforcement of the strictures of international humanitarian law. Mr. Chair, you said earlier that we still see a divergence of views on the details of the declaration we are working on. But against this backdrop, I think it's safe to say that we see absolutely no divergence of objective and values among us. And I know that every delegation represented in this room is committed to this process and to this declaration. Turning now to the specifics of the text in general, let me just say that we remain very grateful to you and your team for your continued efforts and for maintaining the momentum around this process despite the many obstacles that you faced over the last couple of years. We're very pleased in particular that we can now meet together to discuss this text in person in an inclusive manner. We strongly support the approach to the text that you set out in your introductory remarks, and we welcome the new version of the text that you've circulated. And indeed, we're pleased to see that this new version incorporates a number of our proposed edits, but it certainly supports the approach that you set out very clearly when you spoke earlier. We still will, of course, have some further amendments and suggestions to propose, which we believe will again support the approach that you described to us, and we'll come on to those as we progress through the text. But it remains our firm view that we are not far from agreement on a text that will tangibly improve the protection of civilians and promote full compliance with international humanitarian law. With those general comments, I'll now hand over to my colleague just for some specific comments on the text of Section 1. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, as you've said, Section 1 sets the scene for the obligations and commitments covered later in the text. It's therefore important that it strikes the right tone and balance going forward. We think the section in its current form is largely successful, but have two short points. Firstly, the problems arising out of the use of explosive weapons by non-state actors should be explicitly captured. And let me be clear when I say this. Doing so should not in any way detract from the importance of tackling aggression and brutality by states, nor the significant problems arising out of the indiscriminate or disproportionate use of explosive weapons by states, but acknowledging the harm that non-state actors can cause, and also referencing that they too have a responsibility to protect civilians can only strengthen the text. Secondly, and this is a theme that we'll return to later on in the text, what is meant by the term reverberating effects is not currently understood. It isn't, at this time, an internationally recognized term, so interpretation will therefore vary, potentially significantly, from one person to the next. Its use in this case, equated as it is to indirect effects, is fine, but we should be careful of its use elsewhere in the document, without further understanding, particularly when obligations on them arise. I'd also like to make clear on this point that we absolutely recognise the importance of indirect effects and the significant and long-lasting impacts of warfare. And we recognise the substantial work that UNIDIR and others have carried out in this area. However, the way in which the term is used elsewhere in the text may remove clarity. I certainly don't propose beginning a definitional debate, and we have no edits on the use of the term here, but believe it's one that we should bear in mind as we progress through the text over the coming days. Mr. Chairman, that's currently all from us on this section, but please let me reiterate the importance of this process and our full commitment to it. We look forward to 3 days of fruitful discussion in this important area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I give the floor now to Japan, to be followed by the ICRC. Japan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This delegation, can you hear? Okay. This delegation would like to make a general comments rather than making specific comments on the draft declaration. Japan appreciates Ireland's leadership and efforts in holding this consultation on explosive weapons in populated areas. We share the recognition that the use of explosive weapons in populated areas may result in increased collateral harm to civilians. Japan would like to reiterate the importance of protection of civilians in armed conflict, bearing in mind the recent deterioration of the security environment and the increasing number of cases in which the perpetrators are non-state parties, state actors. Mr. Chair, as we have just heard from distinguished ambassador of Ukraine, the Ukraine government and various media reports have revealed that atrocities, including the mass killing of innocent civilians, were committed in areas which was occupied by the Russian forces. Japan takes extremely seriously the fact that a large number of civilians in Ukraine have been killed as a result of acts of Russian forces and is deeply shocked by this revelation. The killing of innocent civilians is a grave breach of international humanitarian law and absolutely unacceptable. Japan vehemently condemns it. The truth about these atrocities must be uncovered, and Russia must be held strictly accountable. Japan has referred the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court on the grounds that war crimes appear to have been committed and counts on progress in the investigation by the ICC prosecutor. Mr. Chair, international humanitarian law is a robust framework that disciplines, among others, the protection of victims of armed conflict in order to limit the damage of conflict and protect those affected by armed conflict. I would like to reiterate the need for compliance with international humanitarian law to enhance the protection of civilians in armed conflict, even in the discussions over EWIPA. Having said that, the basic concept of international humanitarian law is to strike a balance between humanity and military necessity. And in this regard, we would like to point out that the use of explosive weapon per se is not prohibited or restricted. We commend the draft political declaration before us for consultation, as it makes it clearer than previous drafts that compliance with international humanitarian law is fundamental to the discussions surrounding EWIPA. There is no specific definition under existing international law for the weapon category of explosive weapons. But since all weapons are required to be used in compliance with IHL, we believe that the content seeking compliance with IHL will appropriately raise the issue of humanitarian concerns in their use. Japan believes that conforming confirming the importance of compliance with international humanitarian law in the use of explosive weapons in populated areas has a certain significance in reaffirming the importance of civilian protection. We believe that it is important to obtain the support of large number of countries, including major countries, and we hope that this discussion will progress in a manner that will prompt the common understanding by many countries. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I give the next speaker on the list is the International Committee of the Red Cross, to be followed by Netherlands. So ICRC, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Allow me first to commend Ireland for your steadfast efforts and leadership in strengthening the protection of civilians against the use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas over a number of years. The ICRC continues to fully support this process, which we hope will conclude soon with a strong, meaningful political declaration capable of effecting real change on the ground. We welcome the revised draft, which is, in our view, overall significantly improved. It provides a solid framework for action with concrete measures and commitments to better protect civilians from the harm caused by explosive weapons in populated areas. In the ICRC's view, the text needs to be substantially strengthened in a number of areas to ensure the declaration achieves its protective purpose and guides the revision, adoption, and implementation of effective policy and practice. We have submitted detailed comments and language proposals in writing. Once more, current conflicts demonstrate that the use of heavy explosive weapons to strike targets in populated areas is a major cause of civilian harm. Reducing this risk is a humanitarian imperative and often also a legal one. The ICRC has documented for years the devastating consequences of the use of heavy explosives in urban areas, and on this basis has been calling since 2011 on parties to armed conflicts to avoid their use due to the significant likelihood of indiscriminate effects. Recently, we published a milestone report entitled Explosive Weapons with Wide Area Effects, a Deadly Choice in Populated Areas, which provides detailed, practical recommendations on strengthening the protection of civilians against the use of such weapons. You can find copies of this report and of our comments and language proposals for this declaration at the back of the room. The suffering and devastation caused by the use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas cannot and should not be accepted as an inevitable outcome of warfare. Considering that every state involved in armed conflict over the last decades claims to have fully complied with IHL, simply recommitting to do so is unlikely to change the situation in a meaningful manner. Instead, states must unequivocally commit to taking concrete action to ensure IHL is indeed fully complied with and to implementing measures to strengthen the protection of civilians beyond the current situation and irrespective of legal assessments and interpretations that would tend to justify such unacceptably high civilian harm. We therefore urge states participating in these consultations to keep the bar high and produce a strong political declaration of real added value with meaningful commitments to change policies and practices, one that will change the fate of hundreds of thousands of civilians in ongoing armed conflicts, but also for years to come. Against this backdrop, allow me now to make a few concrete proposals on the text of the political declaration in section 1. In this section, we welcome the clear recognition of the grave and multifaceted direct and indirect or reverberating effects that the use of explosive weapons in populated areas has on the civilian population and beyond. But a key area of concern to the ICRC is that the current text overlooks the specific risks associated with the use in urban areas of explosive weapons that have wide area effects. Broadening the political declaration to refer to all explosive weapons, as the current draft does, strengthens it in various aspects, but only provided that the specific risks of those with wide area effects are appropriately underscored. While any explosive weapon has the potential to cause civilian harm, the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas is particularly problematic because the likelihood and extent of civilian harm and of IHL violation is significantly higher than with other explosive weapons. The ICRC therefore strongly recommends that the declaration acknowledges in the preambular section that the wide area effects of explosive weapons are a critical factor aggravating such risk when such weapons are used in populated areas. For this purpose, we recommend adding a new sentence at the end of Preamble Paragraph 1.1, which would read as follows. These risks are exacerbated when the effects of such weapons are expected to extend beyond the military objective due to the weapon's explosive power or lack of accuracy or the number of munitions. This will also provide the rationale for operative paragraph 3.3, which appropriately focuses on explosive weapons whose effects are expected to extend beyond the targeted military objective. We have submitted a number of detailed proposals on paragraphs 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and 1.6, which we have shared with the chair and with all permanent missions. So for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to repeat them here. I would, however, like to spend a moment on preambular paragraph 1.5. In our view, this paragraph should make clear that significant changes are urgently needed to improve the status quo as regards the protection of civilians, and that, while there undoubtedly are positive examples in military policy and practice, much more needs to be done to effectively address the risks associated with explosive weapons' wide area effects. We therefore propose adding a new first sentence that would read as follows. Urgent action is needed to reduce the unacceptable levels of civilian harm when explosive weapons are used in populated areas, and to strengthen the protection of civilians in urban warfare. For the same reason, in the second sentence, we recommend replacing include with reflect the importance of, which would, in our view, constitute a more accurate reflection of existing military policy and practice. Let me conclude, Ambassador, by once more urging all those present here today to spare no effort to develop a meaningful instrument with strong and clear commitments that will make a real difference for the victims of armed conflicts around the world. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker on the list will be Netherlands, to be followed by Uruguay. Netherlands, you have the floor.
Me to start by thanking you, Ambassador Gaffey, and your team for all the work that has gone into the revised version of the political declaration and bringing us together in person. These consultations on the subject of strengthening the protection of civilians in urban warfare is a timely one. The world is watching in horror as the Russian aggression against Ukraine is a clear violation of international law. The direct targeting of civilians and civilian objects, combined with the use of heavy and inaccurate explosive weapons in urban areas, has catastrophic humanitarian effects, as we heard today also by the Ukrainian ambassador. These clear and deliberate violations of international humanitarian law show the need to strict adherence to international humanitarian law by all parties involved in an armed conflict. My delegation has studied the amendments carefully, and we appear to be moving into the right direction. Nonetheless, throughout the text, there are some points that need further improvement for my delegation to be able to subscribe to this declaration. Allow me to assure you that my delegation will work constructively with you to find an outcome that achieves broad support. It is key we have a shared goal and purpose for this political declaration. As you, Mr. Chair, have reminded us on several occasions, the goal of this political declaration is not to ban explosive weapons or set new rules. Rather, it seeks to identify and commit states to a number of practical measures or concrete actions to reaffirm the importance of international humanitarian law, strengthen its implementation, and to strengthen the protection of civilians. For the Netherlands, this means that international humanitarian law is the basis from which we take action. International humanitarian law sets restrictions on the conduct of hostilities and sets rules to protect those who need protection. The measures we agree upon here must thus be practical tools that seek to improve the implementation of those existing rules and regulations, thereby improving the protection of civilians in urban conflict. Throughout the process, the Netherlands has continuously raised concerns over the fact that the term explosive weapons cover a broad range of different types of weapon systems, which have a different impact due to their differing yields, accuracy, and the number of munitions. The recent report by the ICRC from January of this year has provided some useful insights in the different impact of the various types of explosive weapons and should inform our work in this process. In the view of the Netherlands, the political declaration must recognize these differing impacts, including the reverberating effects. Such a recognition in Section 1 of the text is of key importance to my delegation and closely linked to the practical measures to be agreed in Section 3. Let me make a few remarks on Section 1. Further defining and clarifying the political declaration on the type of explosive weapons and effects of these weapons is necessary. We should put more emphasis on where the actual problem lies, which is explosive weapons with wide area effects used in populated areas and with little concern shown for the civilian population. In view of our delegation, a clearer focus would significantly strengthen the declaration. References to only explosive weapons in general makes the declaration unnecessarily broad. The Netherlands supports some of the proposals made on this issue by the ICRC. My delegation suggests to add at 1.4 bis paragraph under 1.4, which would read, and I quote, "The use of explosive weapons in populated areas entails a high risk for civilians and civilian objects, in particular when the effects of such weapons are expected to extend beyond the military objective due to the weapon's explosive power of lack of accuracy or the number of munitions." I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I give the next speaker on our list will be Uruguay, to be followed by Ainu. So Uruguay, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Ambassador, for giving me the floor. I'll speak in Spanish.
Uruguay thanks Ireland for having shown leadership in the work carried out to date as regards the inclusion of significant improvements to the draft declaration. Uruguay is committed to strengthening the disarmament and non-proliferation regime and supports the disarmament program of the United Nations Secretary General. We attach great importance to the humanitarian approach to disarmament. Our country shares the principle of avoiding the use of explosive weapons in populated areas in line with the majority position in our region and the principle of non-use of force. We also recall that we are looking at a political declaration with a humanitarian focus, which seeks to ensure the greatest possible protection of civilian populations and focusing on the consequences of the direct and indirect harm caused by the use of these weapons to lives and to general human well-being. We would therefore have a comment on Section 1. If we want to avoid their use, in addition to deaths of civilians, injuries and disabilities in the long term, as well as displacement, explosive weapons cause serious harm to critical infrastructure, which limits the access of local population to basic services, including healthcare. It is therefore essential that efforts be redoubled to fully apply Resolution 2086 on the protection of healthcare in conflict situations. Uruguay was a co-sponsor of this, together with Spain, Japan, New Zealand, and Egypt, at a time when hospitals and healthcare staff are more necessary than ever. Therefore, like Austria, we welcomed the inclusion of the reference to healthcare in 1.3. We also have signed the Safe Schools Declaration, and which seeks to protect education and schools from attacks in armed conflict situations. We therefore welcome the reference in 1.2 to healthcare and education. On the preamble, we believe that there could be specific reference to the particular gravity of the effects of use of explosive weapons on other vulnerable civilians, not just on women and children, but also, for example, on the ill, refugees, IDPs, and the elderly. We just have one comment on the operative section. I'll just take you through that very briefly, and we'll send our comments in writing subsequently. In the operative section, there is no reference to the way in which humanitarian assistance should be provided in conflict situations and in post-conflict situations. By way of example, we would suggest the inclusion of emergency medical care, physical rehabilitation and psychological support measures to promote family reunification, protection for women of minority groups and other vulnerable groups for social reintegration. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker on the list will be Ainu, to be followed by Sweden. But Ainu, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Ambassador. Excellencies. On behalf of Ainu, we express our appreciation to Ireland for your leadership on this issue and the declaration process. The continued and widespread use of explosive weapons in populated areas, including artillery, rockets, missiles, and airdrop bombs, causes suffering and devastation to civilians, making conclusion of this agreement an urgent priority. Not only are we seeing extensive use of explosive weapons with disastrous consequences for the civilian population in Ukraine, but also in Ethiopia, in Yemen, which is currently experiencing the longest period of heavy bombing in years, and last year in Gaza and Nagorno-Karabakh, to name just a few examples. Over the next few days, there's an opportunity to make a meaningful contribution to the protection of civilians, and we urge everyone to work towards that purpose and to support a declaration that is bold, ambitious, and will make a difference. Turning now to the draft text. The latest draft text has been improved and strengthened in a number of areas, notably in Preamble Section 1, to more clearly and accurately describe the harm caused to civilians when explosive weapons are used in populated areas. However, there are a number of changes still required in order for the declaration to recognise and respond to the civilian harm from bombing and shelling in towns and cities, and to drive action by states to address such harm in policy and in practice. These include, in 1.2, which describes the direct impacts, it would be suitable here to describe the psychological harm from the terrifying experience of living under bombing. It should also include a specific reference to the vulnerability of children who are more susceptible to the impacts of blast and fragmentation effects and at risk of dying as a result, as well as to risks posed from explosive ordnance. We also propose adding that civilians suffer when there is no or limited access to humanitarian relief, and that in besieged areas, this means that basic needs cannot be met. In 1.3, it should reference damage as well as destruction, which can impair the functioning of key infrastructure. It should explicitly mention hospitals as well as housing and schools, which are particularly important when people are in need of emergency medical care, and describe such damage and destruction to infrastructure as a major cause of civilian harm, rather than just aggravating a situation. 1.4 would benefit from references to other longer-term impacts, including to public health, to people's livelihoods, and to development more broadly. And the reference to unexploded ordnance should be changed to explosive ordnance. At this point in the preamble, after describing the humanitarian impacts and before it moves on to the current state of military policies and practices, it needs to have a section that focuses on the particular risk of harm when explosive weapons have wide area effects. There is currently no reference in the draft text to wide area effects, and whilst removing the frequent references to wide area effects in the previous version in the preamble and in some commitments has improved the text in most instances, because it unnecessarily limited the scope of the declaration. Now, however, the text does not sufficiently underline that when explosive weapons have wide area effects, they present a significant and heightened likelihood and risk of harm to civilians. This is an important point to make, along with describing the factors that produce wide area effects, those being a wide blast and fragmentation radius, inaccuracy of delivery, and/or firing multiple munitions across an area. The particular harms when explosive weapons have wide area effects have been widely documented, and embedding this in the text will help in signposting specific actions needed to be undertaken by militaries when it comes to implementation of Commitment 3.3 in particular. In 1.5, this clause should not overstate the extent that current military policies and practices sufficiently address civilian harm from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Driving changes to military policies and practices and the commitments in Section 3 are at the centre of this declaration process. An effective implementation of these will be a key measure of success of this declaration. The first sentence should say some rather than many militaries, which would reflect more accurately current military policy and practice in relation to addressing civilian harm. It should also recognise that there are limitations to the extent that existing military policies and practices sufficiently address civilian harm from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Such tools are designed for military purposes, for example, to assess the effects of a weapon against a target, rather than to assess humanitarian impacts. Furthermore, in 1.6, the inclusion of a specific reference to civilian casualty tracking is a significant and important improvement, which should be reflected in the commitment section. A specific reference to transparency over data collection is important to promote greater transparency over civilian harm, especially from those responsible. There is a moral imperative to take responsibility for harm caused, as well as to understand the impacts of explosive weapon use on civilians to promote both effective responses and accountability. The reference to efforts to record and track civilian casualties should be removed, and similarly, references to where feasible in relation to sharing data and making it publicly available should be removed, especially in this preambular section, which should aspire to higher standards. And lastly, in 1.7, the experiences of survivors should be recognised as important contributions towards policy making by welcoming work to amplify, integrate, and respect the voices of those affected. And finally, an acknowledgement of the gendered and differential experiences of explosive weapon use, which are considerable, is also important to drive effective responses and would be better placed here than narrowly focusing on research on gendered impacts. Thank you very much, and iNews' detailed commentary lays out our changes and specific text suggestions in writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next on our list is Sweden, to be followed by Italy. So Sweden, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My delegation would like to thank you, Ambassador Gaffey, and Ireland for convening these consultations and for the revised draft political declaration on EWIPA. We'd like to reiterate our appreciation for the way in which the consultations are being conducted in an inclusive and transparent manner. Sweden is fully aligned with the statement of the European Union, and I'd like to add the following remarks in my national capacity. These consultations take place at the backdrop of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which Sweden condemns in the strongest terms. Russia bears sole responsibility for this flagrant violation of international law, and Sweden demands that Russia immediately cease its military aggression, withdraw its troops from Ukraine, and respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. We demand respect for international law, including international humanitarian law, and that civilians are protected. Schools, hospitals, and other civilian objects must not be attacked. The images from Mariupol with brutal attacks on hospitals and schools are deeply shocking. not to mention the recent reports of the atrocities committed in Bucha. Shelling of civilian and civilian objects must cease immediately, and humanitarian aid must be allowed in. International humanitarian law is very clear. Civilians must be protected and must not be subjected to attacks. Intentional attacks on civilians and civilian objects violate the laws of war. The same applies to the use of weapons and methods that have indiscriminate effects. Turning now to the specifics of the text, Sweden views positively a political declaration that clearly identifies the problem of EWIPA and that is focused on how compliance to IHL can be improved, including the issue of accountability. We therefore welcome the new draft, which contains many improvements. However, my delegation believes that we should be careful to adopt a declaration that gives the impression of seeking to create new IHL rules and norms. We should also avoid the risk of undermining IHL if the current initiative is worded in the wrong way. Therefore, we think that the declaration should be formulated so that it is clear that IHL fully applies and that the applicable IHL regulates the use of explosive weapons also in populated areas. It is our view that it's not the lack of humanitarian law provisions, but rather the lack of compliance with IHL that is the cause of civil suffering. Going into more detail on Section 1, my delegation has one comment at this moment. It's on paragraph 1.5 in the second sentence, starting with however. In its current wording, the sentence could be read as if the scope for improvement applies to all states, which we don't believe to be completely the reality. Our view is that the majority of states fully comply with their obligations under IHL. So we would therefore suggest the following wording. However, on a global level, there is scope for practical improvements to achieve, and so on. With this, I conclude, and I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Italy, to be followed by Germany. Italy, you have the floor now.
Mr. Chair, at the outset, I join my voice in thanking Ireland for the inclusive and constructive way in which it steered the consultation process and for its continuous efforts to draft and negotiate a political declaration addressing the humanitarian harm arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Italy aligns itself with the statement of the European Union, and I would like now to add some national remarks. This new round of consultations occurs in extremely worrisome circumstances. The conflict in Ukraine is already causing a humanitarian catastrophe. The indiscriminate use of explosive weapons, including populated areas, by Russian forces, resulting in large numbers of civilian deaths and casualties. Deliberate attacks against civilian facilities and infrastructure have left hundreds of thousands of people without access to basic services and will have long-term consequences for Ukrainian people. Italy condemns in the strongest possible terms Russia's unjustified and unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, which is a blatant violation of international law and humanitarian principles. We also firmly condemn the use of banned cluster munitions and anti-personnel mines by Russian forces in clear violation of international humanitarian law. Deploring the tragic loss of life and human suffering, Italy stands in solidarity with all those whose lives have been affected by the war waged by the Russian Federation. Their rights must be upheld at all times, and accountability for any violation and abuse of these rights guaranteed. Mr. Chair, on the proposed political declaration, we appreciate Ireland's efforts to seek and reflect the convergence of the different perspectives, and we welcome the revised draft circulated in preparation on these consultations. We continue to believe that focus should clearly be the protection of civilians and the humanitarian impact of explosive weapons in populated areas. To this end, it's crucial to strengthen the compliance with international humanitarian law, with the aim to protect civilian population and civilian objects from the effects of the hostilities. I'm referring to both direct damage in the form of death and injury, and indirect and long-term effects relating to the destruction of essential infrastructure, loss of services, obstacles to humanitarian intervention, high cost of reconstruction and recovery, displacement and denial of return. At the same time, we believe there is no consensus on the notion of reverberating effects, and then it should be used carefully throughout the text, if not avoided. Mr. Chair, we consider that the legal framework for the protection of civilians is clear, and it is essential to implement it in all circumstances. This relates in particular to the principle of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. It is necessary to adopt and promote military policies and practices and any existing measure in order to avoid and in any event to minimize civilian harm arising from the use of weapons. These elements, as well as the importance of cooperation and exchange of expertise, are key in the political declaration. Finally, we see the political declaration as a stepping stone towards a strengthened cooperation between responsible actors, and Italy stands ready to continue working on ways to improve the protection of civilians from any kind of humanitarian harm. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I give the next speaker on our list is Germany, who will be followed by Ocha. So Germany, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as this is the first time that we take the floor, Germany would like to first thank the Republic of Ireland for convening this new round of long-awaited and in-person consultations on a political declaration to address the protection of civilians from the harm arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Germany fully aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union. We would like to reiterate particularly the unequivocal condemnation of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and its violations not only of jus ad bellum, but also jus in bellum. Let me also express Germany's full solidarity with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. We condemn in the strongest possible terms Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression against Ukraine, which grossly violates the prohibition under international law and in the UN Charter to use force and undermines international security and stability. We demand that Russia immediately cease its military actions, withdraw all its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine, and fully respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence within its internationally recognized borders. Germany resolutely supports Ukraine's inherent right to self-defense and stands behind the Ukrainian armed forces' efforts to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity and the population in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. We demand that Russia immediately and fully respect its responsibilities under international humanitarian law. We are negotiating today a political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Sadly, Russia's military aggression against Ukraine is yet another example of a war in which flagrant violations of the regulations under international humanitarian law that are supposed to assure the protection of civilians are committed on a widespread scale. Our declaration needs to be a clear sign that Russia's conduct, also with regard to the use of EWIPA, is totally unacceptable and is forcefully rejected by all those that subscribe to this declaration. Germany is gravely concerned about the impact on civilians that can arise from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. When explosive weapons were used in populated areas in 2020, a total of 88% of those killed and injured were civilians, according to the Explosive Violence Monitor 2020. The devastating consequences of explosive ordnance in populated areas are often still felt weeks, months, and even years after the end of a conflict. With the declaration that we are negotiating today and in the coming days, we must send out a clear message that this toll is unacceptably high and that we are committed to the better protection of civilians from such harm. Germany is convinced that this goal can best be achieved by adopting a political declaration that effectively contributes to better protection of civilians, first by underlining our commitment to strict compliance and better application of existing international humanitarian law, and second, by initiating a concrete and substantial follow-up process to improve full and universal compliance with existing IHL rules. When we look in detail at the high number of civilian casualties by the use of explosive weapons, we must note that a very high proportion of these casualties actually stem from situations where IHL requirements quite obviously have not been respected. This is, for instance, the case for non-state actors such as the Taliban or the so-called Islamic State. According to the Explosive Violence Monitor of Action on Armed Violence, and also cited in the annual report of the Secretary General to the Security Council on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, non-state actors in 2020 collectively caused 9,706 casualties, of whom 65% were civilians. We have also witnessed unacceptable behavior by state actors in recent conflicts, and I have just reiterated our strong condemnation of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. In the context of the declaration that we are negotiating today, we are seriously concerned about the growing number of reported breaches of IHL, including direct attacks on civilians and civilian objects. We are also witnessing grave violations of IHL with regard to the use of explosive weapons in other conflicts. Our declaration must therefore include a clear call on all parties to armed conflict to respect IHL and the humanitarian principles and fully comply with their IHL obligations when using explosive weapons in order to minimize civilian harm. We see this call already reflected in many parts of the declaration. Additional references, for instance in Section 2, but also in other sections, would strengthen this message in our view. We will revert to those other amendments in our discussion on the other sections. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next speaker on the list is Orcha, to be followed by Humanity and Inclusion. Orcha, you have the floor.
Mr. Ambassador, and I'm pleased to speak this morning on behalf of 8 United Nations entities, including UNOCHA, UNODA, UNOHCHR, UNEP, UNHCR, UNICEF, UNIDIR, and UNMAS. We welcome this round of consultation and are very grateful to Ireland for the revised draft declaration and for all the work that went into it. The current draft reflects a number of the points we made during the last round of consultation in March 2021, and we thank you for that. In particular, we welcome the recognition of both the short and long-term humanitarian impact resulting from the use of a wiper. The references to reverberating effects is absolutely key in our view. These references help underscore the complex and cumulative impacts on civilians over time, including the gender dimension and consequences on particularly vulnerable groups, including children and persons with disabilities. They help emphasize how the use of a wiper may undermine the enjoyment of human rights. They show how the use of a wiper causes considerable humanitarian and development needs over time. We also welcome the inclusion of elements relating to data collection, victim assistance, clearance of explosive ordnance, humanitarian access, impact on the environment, and support to the work of the UN and other organizations in addressing the humanitarian impact of a wiper. The follow-on mechanisms foreseen in the declaration is particularly important to us, and we welcome its inclusion. We look forward to contributing to it, including by sharing good practices we informed of. We have seen how effective follow-up discussion can be with the Safe Schools Declaration. Mr. Chair, we have submitted detailed comments on the declaration, including on the preamble, and I think they're available to all delegations, so I'm not going to get into that. I would like to stress, however, that we continue to believe, as the UN, that the draft declaration should express a clear and unequivocal commitment to avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, and to develop operational policies to this end, as called for by the UN Secretary General on multiple occasions. We note that beside the UNSG, Others have made similar calls. The ICRC, of course, African states in the 2017 Maputo communique, Latin American and Caribbean states in the 2018 Santiago communique, many civil society organizations, and we heard this morning parliamentarians from several countries. As UN entities, we witness every day the devastating short and long-term humanitarian consequences of the use of explosive weapons with wide array effects in towns, cities, and other populated areas. To be very graphic, and we have many examples on the TV these days, we're talking about hospitals and schools destroyed, water networks damaged, children killed by UXOs, millions of people forced to leave their home, people's livelihood being lost, etc. The list goes on and on. Civilians, not combatants, civilians are the main victims of a wiper. Civilians, not combatants, civilians represent an estimated 90% of victims of the use of a wiper. This figure alone should be enough for participants in this consultation to reach a consensus on the need to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. An express commitment to avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide array effects would reflect practice and precedents. There are already well-documented situations, such as in Afghanistan and Somalia, where militaries have enacted policies that avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. In this context, militaries have done so without compromising mission effectiveness or force protection, and the positive impact on the protection of civilians has been almost immediate. So alternatives do exist, and they are effective. Allow me to conclude by saying that the goal of this declaration is to better protect civilians on the ground by addressing the humanitarian impact of the use of a wiper. In that regard, it is of course essential to remind existing IHL obligation. This is the bare minimum, however. We believe indeed that evidence, based on evidence available to us, that just respecting IHL is unlikely to change the situation on the ground. We believe that the commitment to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas is essential to achieving the goal of this declaration. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Humanity and Inclusion, to be followed by Malta. Humanity and Inclusion, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador, for giving us the floor. Since we are doing this for the first time, I would like to thank the Irish Mission on behalf of Humanity and Inclusion, also known as Handicap International, for your leadership and determination to successfully finalize the text of the political declaration to protect civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We will be providing comments from HI's points of view, although we are fully in line with everything that INU is presenting and that presented this morning. Comments that we are providing here are based on our operational, humanitarian, and policy experience. The language that we are suggesting is strictly based on the research findings, but also testimonies of people affected in different ways by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Before starting with section 1, I would like to share our appreciation for modification brought in the title of the political declaration. Deletion of can was an action we were hoping to see because explosive weapons do cause civilian harm and there is no can about it. Generally, we still consider that the text is, in its structure and focus, a good improvement and a good foundation for future negotiations and the strengthening of the protection of the civilians. We still strongly believe that there is a room for improvement to make sure this document serves as a strong and effective tool to protect civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. I will start with commitment 1.2. We are content to see this paragraph recognizing the direct impacts on civilians. To make it more realistic to the actual situation in the areas affected by the use of explosive weapons, we suggest deleting can here and directly express the use of explosive weapons have a devastating impact on civilians. There is so much that we have documented, so many materials that we have produced, but if more evidence is lacking, we can just turn on any news and live follow what is happening in Ukraine or Yemen. Additionally, we are very thankful that the political declaration mentions the psychological impact of explosive weapons in 1.3, but we believe that it would be better fit in the paragraph 1.2 as another example of a direct impact of use of explosive weapons. In fact, it is very difficult to distinguish which part and aspect of war is generally falling heaviest on mental state of civilians. Is it fear for one's life, the life of loved ones, fear of losing own house, or constant internal displacement or refugee abroad? But one thing we are sure of, and what we have collected from survivors that we have directly worked with, is that experience of living under bombing and shelling is terrifying. It causes fear, depression, sadness, and it is a heavy psychological burden. We believe it should be described as a direct impact of explosive weapons use. And related to that, we also think that can should be deleted because there is no doubt that bombing and shelling does cause severe psychological trauma affecting individuals and entire communities. And as such, to that extent, that it also represents a very specific challenge for those providing assistance to these people. So in 1.2, after lifelong disability, we suggest adding text, and living under bombing and shelling causes severe psychological trauma and psychological harm. Also in 1.2, we would like to add that many indirect effects are resulting also from lack of civilian access to humanitarian relief. When humanitarian organizations cannot provide assistance to besieged areas and meet the basic needs of civilians, that people die or suffer more due to lack of services that could be provided if a principled and unimpeded humanitarian access is allowed or possible. Ambassador HI will be referring to the importance of humanitarian access in other sections of the political declaration because the scale of needs generated by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas is often massive. The density of the population and the complexity of urban services and weapons used by parties to the conflict result in unprecedented humanitarian needs, not only for direct victims, but also for the whole population. And we have an example, a recent one from Kharkiv, 1.4 million, and population of Odessa with nearly 1 million people. So destruction of vital infrastructure are done exactly in areas where the specific infrastructure is needed. When a hospital is bombed in a city, it is the whole population of the city who is affected. Paradoxically, in areas where needs are growing due to the bombing and shelling, normal infrastructure would already have been difficult to cope with these needs. If the infrastructure is affected, it is even more difficult to respond to the vital needs. This is where humanitarian assistance is needed. This is why humanitarian actors have to intervene quickly and safely to save lives and release the burden from overloaded services. In 1.4, we are suggesting additional and very obvious reference to other long-term impacts, such as on public health, livelihoods, and development more broadly. We're also suggesting to refer to explosive ordinance instead of unexploded ordinance. With this terminology, we are covering more weapons, but we are also aligning the language with IMAS, which is already very well understood by humanitarian mine actors. In a recent report, HI analyzed the impact of explosive weapons and explosive ordnance on affected population in a Nineveh governorate in Iraq. Last year, 9 out of 13 hospitals in Mosul were still damaged, negatively impacting healthcare capacity and reducing the number of hospital beds by 70%. This is way under the number of hospital beds required to meet the internationally recognized minimum standards in humanitarian context. The contamination of lands by unexploded ordnance and the damage caused by water infrastructure also impacts livelihood and food supply. In Sinjar, for example, for instance, the income on farmers is certain increase has dropped by more than 60%. The total damage caused to agriculture is estimated to have reached a total of 2.1 billion USD. On 1.4 bis, we suggest adding a description of factors that produce the wide area effects to ensure good understanding of this concept, and straightforward explanation that when used in populated areas, these wide area effects systematically create humanitarian consequences, posing threat to civilians and creating damage to civilian objects. So we suggest the following. Wide area effects result from the wide blasts and fragmentation radius of the weapons, inaccuracy of delivery, delivery of multiple munitions across the area, or a combination of thereof. And finally, in 1.7, the experience of survivors should be recognized as an important contribution towards policy making by welcoming work to amplify, integrate, and respect the voices of those affected. And this finalizes the comments on section 1. If you give me just a few more seconds, I would like to announce that during the lunch, we will have a side event with parliamentarians that you have heard this morning. So everybody in the room is welcome to join us. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I give the floor now to Malta, to be followed by Spain. Malta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Malta thanks Ireland for its continued leadership on this declaration. We align ourselves with the statement delivered by the European Union and would like to make some additional general remarks in its national capacity. We recognize the advanced stage these discussions are at and will look forward to their successful conclusion. Protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas has been and is becoming an ever more important theme, particularly given the shocking images we see every day from Ukraine, where Russia is continuing with its military action in violation of the UN Charter and international law. There is evidence suggesting that civilians have been directly targeted, actions which we condemn. We therefore consider these discussions as even more timely given these unfolding events. We underline the importance of the full respect to international humanitarian law and international human rights law by all parties to a conflict, as well as fully support the work of the UN and its various agencies, as well as the ICRC around the world. As a supporter of the Safe Schools Declaration, we welcome the inclusion of schools and educational facilities in this draft declaration. On Section 3, Malta fully supports the provisions of Section 3 and wishes to underline the importance of irregular training of military personnel and the adoption of national policies and practices intended to protect civilians. Such personnel should be fully conversant with the provisions and obligations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in the conduct of their activities. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor now to Spain, to be followed by Norway. Spain, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Allow me first to appreciate all the efforts of the Irish team in leading this initiative that Spain supports. We are confident that our common endeavors will take us to a document that our governments will commit to and that will further strengthen the protection of civilians in urban warfare. Spain aligns to the declaration of the EU, but we want to make some remarks on a national perspective. We have stated before that one of our main concerns is to reach more accuracy in terminology. We have seen progress so far, avoiding vague concepts like wide area effects and trying to get closer to a common understanding of direct and indirect effects, which we prefer to reverberating effects. And it helps also the problem of attribution, for which we thank very much UNIDER's analysis. Although we will need further elaboration in the next stage in order to avoid the rejection of a whole category of weapons that are common in warfare and can be used in respect of IHL. Spain sees strong progress in this new version, although paragraph 3.3 still will need further work in order to establish a clear understanding of the limitations we try to introduce for commando operations that require more clarity. We will address this later on when we deal with this point. We are engaged in working beyond the declaration, and the way ahead is very important to us. We strongly prefer to continue our work in an inclusive multilateral way within the Convention of certain conventional weapons, and are not inclined to open new tracks that are costly, imprecise, and do not reach the ultimate goal of taking on board those we really want to take on board. In order not to take the floor again in this section, allow me to refer to one only point in paragraph 1.2. Spain appreciates the inclusion of several of our proposals, which we hope that have contributed in reaching the text. But we still miss a reference to communication networks as we had proposed in written form. We hope we are still on time to reach consensus on it, and we understand it is an essential infrastructure in warfare. Thank you so much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor now to Norway. And Norway will be followed by Wilf, to be followed by Israel. Norway, you have the floor.
Ambassador, thank you for giving me the floor. I'd like to start by thanking you and your team for your hard work and leadership on this issue. The declaration has been long in the making, not least due to the repeated COVID-related setbacks. And we're very pleased that the process is now back on track with in-person meetings, and we are now getting to the home stretch. Ambassador, we'll give some general overarching comments on this opening statement and then revert with specific comments as we run through the text. First, we'd like to commend you for the direction you've taken the new draft. The many qualifiers that marred last year's text are now gone, and that is good. A strong problem statement is essential to make this declaration effective. And the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in cities cause harm to civilians. There's no need to qualify that further. Second, we welcome the added nuance in the current draft chapters 1, 2, and 4, and we think this strengthens the declaration a lot. We particularly appreciated the added detail and descriptions of the effect on civilians of the use of a weeper in chapter 1. It helps understand why this declaration is so important, as well as what we must do to strengthen the protection of civilians in urban warfare. We also welcome the editorial and linguistic streamlining that you've done throughout the text. Third, while adding more detail might be tempting, we would also like to take this opportunity to call for some restraint in terms of further expansions of the text. The political declaration cannot be everything to everyone. It is first and foremost meant to respond to an acute and grave humanitarian problem, namely the massive civilian harm caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in urban settings. It's tempting to use the opportunity to include all sorts of important things. The downside is that the text becomes unwieldy and unfocused. In the event that we should include new text, we would favor short generic references that can be expanded upon in the prospective conferences and initiatives that are going to be built around this declaration. And we also think that restatements of well-established principles and rules generally have little added value. I know we risk being a bit hypocritical for saying this, because we'll surely have some suggestions here and there that are not in line with the appeal that we just made, but we still think this should be our ambition. Fourth, we'd like to see the reference to explosive weapons with wide area effects reintroduced in some parts of the text, for instance in paragraph 3.3. This relates to the point that I just made about focus. All explosive weapons carry some risks of civilian harm, but it's the use of weapons with a wide impact area in urban settings that cause the greatest humanitarian concerns. And we should highlight the main problem that we are trying to address. And we do not see this as stigmatizing a weapons category. We see it as a realistic assessment of where we should concentrate our efforts. And I should add, we're not addressing weapons, we're addressing the way they are used. In other paragraphs, we're more comfortable with deleting wide area effects reference, for instance, in section 4. Finally, Ambassador, we'd like to state our support for your plan to take the weeper process to a swift conclusion. The topic has been debated extensively for well over a decade, and the case for a political declaration has been solidly made with data and facts to match. And we've had almost 3 years now to reflect on concrete text proposals, so we're in a position to swiftly finalize this process. The historical record is rife with examples of why a declaration on a weeper is called for, but we don't only have to look to the past for motive. Russia's illegal and brutal war of aggression on Ukraine is a daily reminder. Daily, we're seeing the horrendous humanitarian consequences of the bombing and shelling of Ukrainian cities, and an urban humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding before our eyes. Let's not wait until the next catastrophe to act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I am going to give the floor now to Wilf, to be followed by Israel. Wilf, you have the floor.
Very much, Ambassador, and thank you to the mission of Ireland for hosting these consultations and for inviting civil society to participate. WILP welcomes the revised draft political declaration. It's imperative that the declaration promote a presumption against the use of a WIPA and seek to end this deadly and destructive practice. WILP supports the detailed comments on this revised text made by INU, of which WILP is a member, and we have a few additional points to raise or amplify and have submitted these in writing already. Paragraphs 1.2 and 1.3 should use the language that the use of a WIPA does have these impacts rather than can have these impacts. 1.2 should also add a reference to the gendered impacts and other differentiated impacts on marginalized people from the use of a WIPA. In 1.3, the destruction of hospitals and markets should be added to the list of affected sites. And rather than saying that such destruction further aggravates civilian suffering, 1.3 should say that it is a major cause of civilian suffering. The reference to the natural environment in 1.3 should remove the word natural, and it could also specify that pollution can happen through weapons residues and pollutants released by objects that are damaged or destroyed. 1.4 should separate out the reference to displacement from the reference to development and unexploded ordinance, as it's not just displaced people that face the impacts that are described here, but also people who remain. 1.4 should also reference other impacts beyond the Sustainable Development Goals, such as the use of a WIPA impedes the enjoyment of human rights. In 1.5, we support the ICRC comments here. We think it should say that some rather than many militaries already implement relevant policies, and it should recognize that these policies are not always practiced or implemented in ways that sufficiently prevent civilian harm. Given the negative impacts of the use of a WIPA for human rights, this paragraph should also reference international human rights law alongside IHL. 1.6 should call for the collection of data related to disability and to race or ethnicity in addition to sex and age. The phrase where feasible should be removed in reference to sharing and making data publicly available. And the phrase efforts to should be removed in relation to recording and tracking civilian casualties. This paragraph should also call for collection of data on the types, locations, and effects of the weapons that are used so that we can better track which weapon systems are causing harm. This will be relevant for understanding the impacts of particular weapons as well as for making arms transfer assessments. WILP welcomes the improved call for research into the gendered impacts of the use of a WIPA in 1.7 bis. This paragraph should also call for research into other differentiated impacts, such as on people with disabilities, and we support the comments from Uruguay in this regard. This paragraph could also be further strengthened by urging further work to amplify, integrate, and respect the voices of all those affected rather than welcoming work to empower and amplify such voices. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor now to Israel to be followed by Togo. Israel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Before I comment on the agenda items of the meeting, I would be remiss not to address the war in Ukraine. In this vein, Israel condemns the unjustified Russian invasion into Ukraine. There is no justification for violating Ukrainian sovereignty and targeting innocent civilians. We are also gravely concerned by the reports emanating from Bucha. The government of Israel calls upon Russia to respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and end its attack. Mr. Chair, Israel believes that the issue of protection of civilians in urban warfare is of utmost importance. We would like to thank you and your team for the opportunity to discuss this important issue and work together on it. However, we have a number of fundamental concerns regarding the text of the declaration in order to truly address this issue in a holistic manner. Firstly, as we've stated in the past, Israel cannot support an approach that narrowly frames the issue of the protection of civilians in terms of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas and purports to categorically stigmatize lawful weapons. The humanitarian implications of urban warfare and their root causes span across a wide range of factors and include a variety of means and methods of warfare rather than just certain types of weapons. a political declaration that focuses on the use of a WIPA and fails to seriously address the myriad of factors for detrimental humanitarian implications in urban warfare would be misleading, and most importantly, it will not truly promote our common goal of the protection of civilians in a tangible and practical way. Furthermore, we emphasize that the terms explosive weapons and populated areas are not IHL terms, nor is there any agreed understanding among states about their meaning. Secondly, Israel is of the view that the declaration should stick to existing IHL, which is a sufficient legal framework for dealing with the issue. Thirdly, the current draft still does not properly reflect the reality of non-state armed groups who often deliberately conduct their operations from within populated areas, while making use of human shields and other tactics designed to intentionally exploit the proximity of civilians and civilian objects to military objectives. Moving forward, we will give specific textual suggestions in the relevant sections on this matter. Fourthly, in addition to the IHL obligations referred to in the draft declaration, we think that it is important to clearly express in the text that explosive weapons are legitimate means of warfare and are not forbidden per se, while there must be use, of course, in accordance with IHL. We will provide our specific comments on Section 1 later on. I thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor now to the representative of Togo.
Thank you very much, sir. Togo welcomes this series of negotiations on banning explosive weapons in populated areas, and we thank the Irish presidency as well as all the stakeholders for their tireless efforts to ensure the adoption of the political declaration on this important issue. Sir, armed conflicts, unfortunately, are continuing to inflict untold harm on mankind. No continent is spared, unfortunately. This situation is one which must be acknowledged with courage, and we see that this is a collective failure. Our incapacity to put an end to the scourge of war, despite the commitment of all states in keeping with the preamble of the United Nations Charter. Togo believes, however, that if we are unable to put an end to the absurdity of war, we nonetheless need to humanize it, committing ourselves even more firmly and with greater determination and will to ban not only the use of a certain category of weapons leading to mass destruction, but also weapons which indiscriminately strike civilian populations in densely populated areas. To this end, Togo repeats its firm support for the process that we've initiated, the IWIPA process started over 2 years ago. And my delegation believes, in light of substantive improvements that have been made to the draft declaration since our last discussions, even if there are still improvements possible, we believe that we should be able to reach consensus to adopt it by the end of our meeting or of our work. And Togo finally would like to note with satisfaction that this present version of the declaration takes account of aspects of access and humanitarian assistance, the responsibility of states in this respect. And here again, we would repeat that we are deeply attached to this. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you.
On that note, we will end our session for this morning. Thank you very much for your engagement, and we will resume again at 3 o'clock, starting with statements by the Republic of Korea, Human Rights Watch, and the Danish Refugee Council. Thank you very much, and we'll see you back here at 3 o'clock. Thank you. It's good. I just have to run out for 1 second. I'll be back. Oh.